today is a longtime friend of the World Affairs Council who has spoken to us a number of times, most recently in a conversation with NPR foreign correspondent Soraya Sarhadi-Nelson on the Ukraine and Russia in 2014. William Taubman is the Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science Emeritus at Amherst College. His biography, Khrushchev, the Man in His Era, won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Critics Circle Award for Biography. We do have a few copies of that book up here. He is also the author of Stalin's American Policy from Entente, Détente to Cold War, and co-author with his wife, retired Amherst College professor of Russian Jane Taubman of Moscow Spring. Bill Taubman was president of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies in 2009 and chairs the Academic Advisory Committee on the Cold War International History Project at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. He has received the Karel Kumar Medal of the Czech Republic and the Order of Friendship from the Russian Federation. We are also delighted to have been able to share him with many of other World Affairs Councils across the country where he has spoken and gotten rave reviews. Today, he's going to be talking to us on the rise and fall of Mikhail Gorbachev and their lessons for the Putin era. Please join me in welcoming Bill.
In the Me Too era, I should explain why I was standing so close to your vice president. Because they wanted to record her through my microphone as well as this one for the website.
I wish you'd explained it to me.
Let's.
It was a great event until the mic broke out.
It is a pleasure for me to be back speaking to your group, as I did once upon a time about Khrushchev, when Ken, right, was the president, and then that other time that Mary Beth mentioned. I'm going to talk mostly about Gorbachev's rise and fall, and I'll show you some pictures along the way. And then at the end, depending upon how much time we have, I'll try to talk about the Putin era as well in comparison to the Gorbachev era. I want to begin with a quote from a 19th century British historian, Thomas Carlyle. He said, "History is but the biography of great men." Wrong in lots of ways. First of all, there are women, rest. And secondly, of course, there are many other things that make up history, that affect history. Social forces, economic conditions, international developments, ideas, institutions. But in the case of some individual political leaders, they turn out to have a decisive impact on history, and one of them is Mikhail Gorbachev, who finished off Soviet totalitarianism and who more than anyone else ended the Cold War. And if you'd like, when we get to the end, we can talk about the debate as to whether Reagan or Gorbachev did more to end the Cold War. Now, there are two things that are important about Gorbachev, sort of in general, which explain why he was so important. One, he had the power that came with being the communist leader of the Soviet Union. He was not constrained by the rule of law, they didn't really have one, by a free press, by interest groups, by constitutional norms, which constrain our presidents, we hope. He was the boss. He was a dictator. They used to say over the years when I was visiting the Soviet Union beginning in 1964, they used to say occasionally, dissidents would say, it may take a Stalin to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union, meaning somebody of great power and force to tear down the edifice of totalitarianism that Stalin himself had created. The other thing about Gorbachev that's very important, because it leads back to his biography, is his uniqueness. He was different. He did not do what other leaders would have done in his place. The Politburo, which consisted in the Kremlin of the Politburo of the Communist Party, had 12 to 15 leaders, and only 3 of them followed Gorbachev, supported him until almost the very end. You probably remember one of them, Eduard Shevardnadze, the foreign minister. You may remember another one, Alexander Yakovlev, the This was Gorbachev's chief ally. And then there was a third man, Vadim Medvedev, whose name most people don't know. But the point is, there were only three of them, and they were only in a position to support him because he had either put them there or kept them there. In other words, they were not independent forces. They were only supporting him because he had put them there or kept them there. Now, this uniqueness leads to biography. Why? Because when somebody does things that nobody else would have done, I can't prove that, but I can argue it, it raises the question of why they did the unique things that they did. And one possible reason has to do with their character, their personality. That is, how did they get to be a person who would do what none of the other leaders would have done? What he did was try to democratize Russia. What he did was end the Cold War. And as I say, I don't think any of the other leaders, apart from those three, would have tried to do that. So, I am going to divide my remarks into attempting to answer 3 or 4 or maybe 5 questions. It depends on time. The first question I definitely will address, and that is, how did Gorbachev become Gorbachev? How did a peasant boy from the northern Caucasus in southern Russia, whose essay in praise of Stalin in high school won a prize, how did he grow up to be the gravedigger of the Soviet system? That's number one. Number two, how on earth, why on earth, did the Soviet regime choose him to be their leader? Of course, they didn't know he was going to be the gravedigger of the Soviet system, but they might have had some clues. They nonetheless picked him to be their leader. Why? Third, why did he attempt to democratize a country which had never known democracy in its entire centuries-long history, with the exception perhaps of a few chaotic months in 1917 during the Russian Revolution? And those chaotic months were followed by the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks. So if anti-Bolshevik Russians looked back and thought about what democracy had meant in 1917, it might well have concluded it had brought them Soviet totalitarianism. Along with why did he try to democratize is the question of why did he fail, so that he was ousted in December 1991. Now, I have 2 other questions which I'll address probably more briefly in order to save time to talk about Putin. One is, how did Gorbachev and arch-conservative American President Ronald Reagan end up as almost perfect partners in ending the Cold War? How could this have happened? And the final question is, why did Gorbachev allow the Soviet Union's East European empire to crumble without firing a shot to preserve it? Okay, let's talk first about how Gorbachev became Gorbachev. And here I want to speak briefly about his childhood and then about his university years at Moscow State University. He was born in March 1931. That means he's 87 and he's not in good health. We'll talk about that later if you like. But he grew up in terrible times. In the famine, whoops, we'll get to that in a minute. That's him with his grandparents. You can leave it up, Sid, that's okay. He grew up in terrible times. Yeah, let's leave it there. He grew up in terrible times. 2 uncles and an aunt died in the famine of 1932. Both of his grandfathers were arrested and sent into the Gulag, although both managed to be released. The Nazis occupied his village for several months in 1942. And after the war, or as the war was ending, famine returned to that part of the Soviet Union, more than that part. And then, of course, the last years of Stalin were horrendous. Russians expected a kind of relaxation. After all, they had won the war at a terrible cost, but Stalin clamped down again with all the totalitarian controls. Well, how did a man, a boy, growing up in these terrible times emerge, as Gorbachev did, filled with optimism, self-confidence, self-esteem, and trust in his fellow citizens? How could this have happened? Obviously, genes, one has to assume, played a role. But so did his upbringing. And here we have a picture, the first one, of Gorbachev as a little boy with his grandparents, his maternal grandparents. They were apparently quite wonderful to him. He talks about them treating him tenderly. He says that he was their favorite grandchild. You can even see in the picture the signs. The grandfather with his hand on Gorbachev's shoulder, the grandmother with her arm on his shoulder, little Misha Gorbachev with his hand on his grandfather's knee. Now let's take a look at Gorbachev and his father. His father, Sergei, was also, by all accounts, a wonderful man. And I think you can see it. He looks like a kind person, doesn't he? I mean, you can't tell for sure, but he looks that way. He didn't try to dominate his son. He tried to encourage him. They worked together. In 1947-48, they worked together in the summer in the field, manning a mammoth harvester in a competition to see who could bring in the most grain. They worked almost 24/7, rain and shine, day and night, and they won. And his father was awarded the highest honor the Soviet Union could bestow, the Order of Lenin, and asked that his son also receive one. They said, we can't give an Order of Lenin to a kid, but he got the second highest order, which was called the Order of the Red Labor Banner, which he wore all through high school on his one jacket. Now, if we can go to the next one, Sid. We have his mother. I'll start talking about her. His mother was harsh. She turned out to be the one who was, there she is, the disciplinarian. There is she with Gorbachev as a boy. My wife Jane, who taught at Amherst, Russian, taught at Amherst for many years, and I had 8 long interviews with Gorbachev, about 2 hours each in his Moscow office. And during one interview, he was talking about his mother. And he said, in 1942, when he was 11 years old, she picked up her belt to whip me again. I was frankly shocked that he would confide this in us. I was already beginning to think what this might have meant for him. But he continued, I grabbed her arm and I pulled it off and I said, never again. And at this point he continued, she began to weep. And before I could even think of daring to ask why was she weeping, he said, because I was the last thing she could control, and now she could no longer even control me. Now, she wasn't a tyrant. She wasn't an ogre. She kept him alive during World War II when his father was at the front fighting the Nazis for 4 years. In his own way, he loved her, but without trying to reduce a complicated political leader to the simple product of his upbringing, it seems to me that we are justified in speculating that some of his confidence, his optimism, his trust in other people came from the wonderful upbringing he had from his father, from his grandfathers, his grandparents, and at times from his mother, and that perhaps some of his need for the kind of approbation that a political leader gets if things are going well might have reflected the need he had for that kind of approval because he didn't get it from his mother. Anyway, one quick story about the kind of boy Gorbachev was in high school, which I can't help thinking is on our minds today as we hear so much about other people in high school. But he had a girlfriend. Oh, one more picture of the mother, Sid. Here is Gorbachev's mother with Gorbachev, the grown young man, and with his younger brother, born 16 years after he was. That's an interesting question. Now let's go on to the next one. Here is Gorbachev in high school, where he was the leading man in his high school drama group. And there, the girl to his left and our right is his girlfriend, who was the leading lady in the high school drama group. She was also the editor of the high school newspaper, which was a wall newspaper, so that since they didn't have printing press or a Xerox machine or anything. Well, one day he came upon her editing the newspaper and discovered she hadn't done it right. And he bawled her out. And then he took her in to meet the editorial board of the newspaper and he bawled her out again in their presence. She was mortified, she was humiliated, but as they left the school, he asked her out that evening. And she said, "How can you do this to me? First you humiliate me, and then you ask me out." And his answer, which she recalled years later, was, "My dear, these are two different realms." Okay, Moscow University. Moscow University, where Gorbachev attended, which he attended from 1950. Oh, I'll tell you who he is in a minute. That's okay, leave it there, Sid, please. From 1950 to 1955 was the leading institution of higher education in the Soviet Union, and probably still is in Russia. And like any good institution of higher education, it evoked certain questions and doubts in its students, even though this was still, for the first 3 years, the period of Stalinist indoctrination. The reason it could do it was that there were professors there who'd been trained either before the revolution or in the 1920s, when there was still greater freedom. And the other students were very smart kids who had lots of questions, and who, alone in their rooms with their friends at night, whom they trusted, dared to talk about what they understood to be the truth. Now, Gorbachev at this university had two great friends who had a great effect on his life. This is Zdeněk Mlynář. He was a Czech student studying in Moscow. And get this, in 1968, 18 years later, he was Alexander Dubček's chief ideologist during the Prague Spring, when Czechoslovakia tried to break away and democratize in the Soviet Union. Now, in 1950 to 55, Mlynář was not yet, you're ahead of me. Mlynář was not yet the man he would become, but he was, by all accounts, a kind of idealistic communist who understood that Stalinism had run amok and hoped that they would someday get back to what he thought of as the idealistic beginnings of communism in the Soviet Union. And again, I have a story that illustrates how good they were friends. Gorbachev talks about Mlynář as his best friend and vice versa. At one point, the two of them were watching, and this may sound like an oxymoron, a Stalinist musical comedy. There were such things. I've seen a lot of them, and they're quite good. They're good movies. They're very tuneful. They're amusing. Anyway, the one they were watching was about peasants bringing in the harvest, singing while they worked. And after they brought in the harvest, the milkmaids descended on the local store and purchased beautiful fabrics to make into beautiful dresses. This is what was in the film. And while this was going on, Gorbachev leaned over and said to Mlynář, "It's not true. The only reason they work is that they're forced to, and there's nothing in the stores, nothing." So, the second person, now we can go on, Sid, please, to the next picture. The second person was Gorbachev's wife, Raisa, in the polka dot dress. She was 1 year younger than Gorbachev. She was 1 year ahead of him at Moscow University. She was a student in the philosophy department rather than the law school, which had more prestige than the law school in a country in which there was no rule of law. Most of the people we talked to about her, she died in 1999, and I'll return to that, but most of the people we talked to about her said she was stronger than he, that she was a maximalist who didn't like to compromise. And as he explained to us, he said he'd been a maximalist too, but as a politician, he had to learn how to compromise. And here I should interject that the very word compromise in Russian carries a pejorative connotation, kompromis. If you are a person who compromises, you are likely to be an opportunist of some sort, because strong Russian leaders don't compromise. Some of the aides we talked to about Raisa said Gorbachev's problem was that he didn't listen to her enough. But other aides said Gorbachev's problem was that he listened to her too much. Okay, how did he get to be the leader? What on earth possessed them to make him their leader? Here we have to divide the story between the years 1955, when he returned from Moscow to the city of Stavropol in southern Russia, near his native village, until 1978, when he was promoted to Moscow, and then 78 in Moscow until 85, when he's made the Soviet leader. So why did he get promoted in Stavropol from a lowly functionary in 1955 to province party boss in 1969-70, one of the most important positions in the Soviet Union? Well, he worked hard and well, and he hid his heretical thoughts that he'd been developing as a child and especially at the university. But most of all, ironically, because he seemed to be the perfect product of communism. The Soviets used to talk about the quote-unquote new Soviet man or new Soviet woman. What they meant was a person who was honest, hardworking, incorruptible, idealistic, and he seemed to be all of these things. And when Jane and I went down to Stavropol to interview people who had known Gorbachev at that time, which we did twice for a couple of weeks each, almost everyone, when we asked the question, what was your first impression of Gorbachev, said the Russian word erudированный. Anybody speak Russian here? It means erudite. He went to Moscow University. He knew more than any of us did. But furthermore, the second thing most of them said, at least the ones who liked him, and they didn't all like him, was he treated his wife so beautifully. I won't go into stories. I've been to the Soviet Union 30 times over the years, and I've been in some situations where I've seen Soviet bureaucrats treat women horrendously. I'll just mention one occasion. When I was working on the Khrushchev book, I went to Donetsk, which is now in Russian rebellious eastern Ukraine, then wasn't. And I was traveling with Sergei Khrushchev, Nikita's son, and Sergei's wife. And we were staying in a hotel, and early in the morning, some bureaucrats came who were going to take us around. And the first thing they ordered was 200 grams of vodka at 8 o'clock in the morning, which they downed. And before long, they were chasing waitresses around the cafeteria and into the kitchen. I don't want to make too much of this or claim it's a Russian national character, but I think Gorbachev was an admirable man and viewed that way by especially the women who knew him and worked with him. Now, I'm going to show you another picture. Sid? Oh, I forgot this one. Okay, we'll linger for this. This is Gorbachev as a student. I call this Gorbachev in his French actor mode. And probably they have whited out his birthmark as they did for what they viewed as unattractive features. Okay, now let's go on to the next one. Okay, here is a picture of the Gorbachevs in the Caucasus. He, Mikhail, and she, Raisa, are sitting on a rock, and somebody's taking their picture. And if by some chance you've looked in the book where this picture exists, you would know that the person taking their picture is Yuri Andropov. Remember him? He was a Soviet police chief for many years. Then he became the Soviet leader until he died rather too quickly after being hitched to a dialysis machine. Anyway, Andropov took a liking to him, but he was not the only Soviet leader who happened to be vacationing down there in their area where there are lots of resorts. But Andropov in particular was later described by Raisa as the key person in Gorbachev's advance. So why did Andropov like him? Well, Andropov, in his own way, and typical of the doubleness of a lot of Soviet people, and especially leaders, but not too high leaders, he would maybe unique in this, was, I won't call him a liberal, he wasn't. He sent dissidents into psychiatric institutions and pumped them through of drugs to shut them up. But he also liked poetry. And he had on his desk in the Kremlin a series of books by famous political philosophers of ancient and more recent times. And one of the people who worked for him, for Andropov at that time, we interviewed, And this guy told the story of Andropov's books on his table. And he said, one day I asked Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov, why do you have those books on your table? And Andropov said, so I can speak with you, the young, better educated aides, as an equal. So he was also a not very educated man who aspired to be something of an intellectual and saw Gorbachev and his wife as just that. Moscow, 1978 to 1985. If you go on to the next one, Sid, good. That man sitting down with the white hair is Andropov's successor. You probably remember his name, Konstantin Chernenko. He too died within less than 2 years. He was very sick even when he took over. And by the time this picture taken, they were reduced to propping him up in a fake polling booth in the hospital to pretend he was voting, and sitting him down at a pretend desk in the hospital to pretend he was working. Gorbachev was the youngest of all the Politburo members at that time. He was only 54. He was young and vigorous, and all of the others were no match for him. That is why he was promoted. Not because they thought he would try to democratize the Soviet Union. They thought he would carry out some moderate reforms, but he went much farther than they expected him to. Okay, why, once he was in power, did he attempt to democratize the Soviet Union? I forget what the next picture is, Sid. Let's take a look. Oh, that's Reagan. We'll hold that for a minute. Well, as I say, Gorbachev had dissident ideas from very early on. I once put that description to somebody who knew him well from the early years, and they said, no, he wasn't really a dissident, he was a doubter. He had ideas and he acted on them. Now, he was not the only one in Soviet history who wanted to carry out at least some reforms. Khrushchev, the man I wrote my other book about in 1956, you'll remember, denounced Stalin, tried to carry out reforms, then retreated, ultimately was ousted. And if you go back even further, even in Stalin's time, there was a leader named Nikolai Bukharin who didn't agree with Stalin about the collectivization and murder of millions of Russian peasants. So there was this trend, and it was fairly widespread in universities and among the intelligentsia, but there was no one in the top leadership who thought the way Gorbachev did, as I've already said. So he tried. Why did he fail? Well, because when he took the lid off, everything exploded. There turned out to be ethnic and national separatisms in the Baltics, in the Caucasus, non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union who wanted to be independent. There turned out that the economic system, which he had hoped to make more efficient by introducing elements of a market economy, resisted change, and the people who had benefited from that resisted change. Even in the beginning, he didn't get recognized by the people he hoped would work with him to end the Cold War as the reformer that he actually was. And to focus on personality again, I think that Gorbachev's confidence, verging on arrogance, both helps to explain why he dared to try to democratize this country, but it also helps to explain why he failed in the following sense. Because he overestimated his ability to control the communist hardliners who didn't like what he was doing, and he kept them on, he kept them close until they launched the August 1991 putsch against him. And he also underestimated his main nemesis, Boris Yeltsin. Thought he was a lightweight, thought he was a loose cannon, thought he could never amount to anything until Yeltsin turned out to defeat Gorbachev himself. Okay, a couple of words about Reagan and Gorbachev. When Gorbachev met Reagan in Geneva in November 1955, and there they are synchronizing watches, and if you go to the next one, Sid, you'll see them sitting together in the beach, the pool house next to the lake, which was a kind of turning point in their meeting. When Gorbachev went there, he had no great expectations, and neither did Reagan, for what would come of their meeting. You remember that Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire and built a strategic defense initiative, which the Russians took as an effort to sort of spin them into a ditch and get an advantage in space. Well, it turned out that several things brought them together. One was their unexpected joint commitment, as it turned out, to abolishing nuclear weapons. And they were both unique in that. When Reagan went back after the next summit at Reykjavik, after he had come very close to agreeing with Gorbachev to abolish nuclear weapons, he found that nobody in Washington, at least in his cabinet, appreciated what he had done. And Margaret Thatcher, least of all, over in London. And Gorbachev didn't have too many supporters either for abolishing nuclear weapons in his entourage, because the Soviets had always thought that although they were backward in many ways, their nuclear prowess created equality with the United States. So if so, what brought them together? Well, as I say, their shared commitment to abolishing nuclear weapons, and I argue in the book a series of remarkable personal similarities which helped to create a personal chemistry between them. I talk about this at some length, so I don't want to go into it, lest we have no time to talk about Putin, but it's really quite remarkable. And I even get to the point in that chapter where I quote from a description of the Reagan marriage, in which you could substitute the word Gorbachev for Reagan and Raisa for Nancy, and it would describe the Gorbachev marriage. Anyway, that is an interesting question to which we could return if you'd like. Why did he allow Eastern Europe, the Soviet Empire, to crumble and break away without firing a shot? Well, as one of his top aides told us at one point, referring to the Berlin Wall, he said, Gorbachev's secret dream was to wake up one morning and find that the wall had fallen of its own accord. This after his predecessors had built the wall, prepared to go to war if necessary to keep Europe and Germany divided. How could he have this view that he really wanted it to fall? Because it turns out his dream was to transcend East and West divisions in Europe, to end the Cold War, to get rid eventually of both NATO and the Warsaw Pact, to build a new architecture of security in Europe, not based on either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. And so he was relaxed about the fall of the wall, although he was worried that it might lead to conflict between the states. That is, that the Germans might move too quickly to unify Germany, and that his own people would force him to resist that. But even when, during the course of 1989, mixed governments, that is communist and non-communist, began to form in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, he took that relatively relaxed fashion as well. Because at that point he thought it would take a while for Germany to reunify and for his vision to be brought about, but that eventually it would be. So again, I think we see here his optimism, his idealism, and a lot of people would say, especially in Russia, but also in the West, his naivete about what would happen, which went much faster, of course, German reunification. Then he agreed to Germany's remaining in NATO, even once reunified. And then he thought he had a promise from Secretary of State James Baker. We have Baker's words in a meeting with Gorbachev on February 10th, 1990. At one point in their conversation, Baker said that NATO's military jurisdiction would not expand 1 inch to the east. But when Baker got back to Washington, H.W. Bush said no, 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 no. And as you know now, NATO remained in effect. It expanded to all the way up to the Baltic borders with Russia. So my conclusion about Gorbachev is that he was a kind of hero. He created or allowed the first free elections in the Soviet Union. He created a functioning parliament to replace a rubber-stamped Supreme Soviet. Free speech, Glasnost, which he began with, became free speech by the time he left office. And he ended the Cold War and reduced the threat of a nuclear holocaust, not single-handedly, but more than anybody else. But if he is a tragic hero, and by the way, it looks as if I'm going to Moscow in December to talk about this book, and I'm wondering whether I dare say he was a hero, because there's so much animus toward him that I may get booed off the stage. But at any rate, I regard him as a hero, but he was a tragic hero. He tried to reform and modernize and democratize the Soviet Union, and by the time he was through, the Soviet Union collapsed. Its empire disappeared, and Russians hold against him to this very day, not all of them, but the majority of them, the economic chaos that was created by his reforms, the collapse of the country, the loss of the empire and its superpower status. And as you know, and I'll go on to this in a minute, we now have a reversion in Russia to the kind of authoritarianism that Gorbachev was trying to eliminate, and we live in the midst of a new Cold War. But the most tragic element about Gorbachev, actually before, move it ahead, Sid, if you would, and before we get to the most tragic element, well, this is also in a way tragic, you'll see. There is a picture of Raisa gazing adoringly at her husband. I think it's fair to say that. Okay, next one, please, Sid. This, I wanted to say with Raisa, but these got mixed up. This is a picture of Yeltsin in 1991. Gorbachev is mortally wounded by the August Putsch, the August coup, which doesn't kill him. He's still alive, but he's really a political goner. And Yeltsin, whom he humiliated, is now humiliating him. And you can see that. But if you can go on to the next one, Sid. Here is a picture of Raisa in 1998, when she is either already ill and dying or on the verge. And you can see the grief in his eyes. And finally, Sid, there he is weeping at her funeral in 1999. Now, after she died, in one of the interviews, he actually went so far as to say, "I am guilty. I am the one who did her in." What could he have meant? I think he meant that she turned out to be temperamentally unsuited for the revolutionary role she played as the first modern Soviet First Lady. He was hardened by then. He could let the criticism, the storm of criticism, roll off his back, but she was too sensitive. She was too vulnerable. During the August Putsch of 1991, she had a minor stroke, was deprived of speech, lost movement in one arm. She gradually recovered, but she was never the same person. And yet she stood by his side. Even in 1996, Soviet Union is gone. Yeltsin is running for re-election as Russian president against the communist leader. And Gorbachev insists on running for president too. He ends up getting less than 1% of the vote. Less than 1% of the vote. But he campaigns for weeks in 20 cities all over the Soviet Union. And she insists, as she had always done, on going with him, accompanying him. And on some of these places, on some of these occasions, in some of these towns, they won't let him speak in the hall that he's reserved. On at least one occasion, somebody spits in his face. On another occasion, somebody slaps him across the face. And all of this adds up to her eventual decline and death. In his last book, next to last book, he just published one a couple of weeks ago. But in his next to last book, he titled it, "I Remain an Optimist." But I'm not sure he does. Because not only is he still the target of constant criticism from so many of his countrymen and women, but he lives in a dacha, a big villa outside of Moscow, mostly alone. His daughter, Irina, who is visible there in that picture, had lived with him after his wife's died, with her daughters and her husband for quite a while. Then she had lived next door so that if anything happened to him, she could come running. But finally, she, like her mother, couldn't take it anymore. And now she lives mostly in Germany. So the poor man is alone in this big house with a chef, with bodyguards, with a chauffeur, thinking his thoughts. That's where I have usually ended my rise and fall of Gorbachev talk. And I could, but usually people want to go on and talk a little bit about Putin. So I will. I was just telling somebody at lunch that the Gorbachev Foundation has invited me and my wife to go over to Moscow in December for a ceremony at the foundation where they will present, they call it презентация, of my book. And I was told that he hasn't read the book because he doesn't read English. He's read some translations of book reviews, but he apparently has approved the invitation. The book is, as you can tell from my talk, mostly favorable, but it's critical of him at quite a few occasions, and I'm just hoping that once he reads it, he'll still want me to come over. All right, very quickly, so there's time for some questions. Putin's Russia is the opposite of Gorbachev's Soviet Union. Domestically, Gorbachev, free press, Putin limits the press. Gorbachev creates a free vote and a genuine parliament. Putin partially rigs the vote and tames the parliament. Gorbachev allows free assembly. Putin cracks down on demonstrations. Foreign policy. Gorbachev ends the Cold War. Putin creates, not by himself, if we had time, I'd talk about it, I think together with the United States, a new Cold War. Gorbachev disarms, Putin rearms. Gorbachev frees Eastern Europe. Putin cracks down on a buffer zone, not in Eastern Europe, although he's trying to muck things up there too, but in what they call the near abroad, the former republics of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev embraces the United States. Putin challenges the United States. He reverses almost everything Gorbachev has done to the point where it reminds me of Trump reversing everything that Obama had done. Put that in parentheses, I don't mean to be too political. The other thing that strikes me in retrospect, if we compare, on the one hand, pre-Gorbachev Soviet Union, together with Gorbachev's Soviet Union, with, on the other hand, Putin, it looks to me as if Putin's Russia is much more solid and likely to last longer. Now, of course, the Soviet Union lasted for 80 years, but, or was it 70? I have to figure that out again. But when you look at it, when Gorbachev came to power, it was already falling apart. And of course, Gorbachev's Soviet Union collapsed. So let's just think about this for a minute. In the pre-Gorbachev Soviet Union, the economy was so centralized that it didn't work properly. And under Gorbachev, it blocked efforts at reform. Putin has not created a fully market economy, but I guess you'd call it a sort of modified state capitalism. But it's more solid, it seems to be more effective, it produces more goods, and therefore people are happier than they were, either pre-Gorbachev or under Gorbachev. Technology. Because of the extreme secrecy in the Soviet Union, where scientists couldn't even talk to each other often, let alone their fellow scientists in the West, technology, that's one reason, there were others too, the emphasis on the military at the expense of civilian technology. Technology lagged. Technology today, well, I guess if they could meddle in our elections and hack into our sites, at least in the areas of computers, they're doing pretty well. Ideology. The Soviet ideology, as you know, was Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism. There was a required way of writing and reading and everything else. And it was sort of internationalist. And by the time the Soviet Gorbachev came in, most people didn't believe it anymore. Putin's ideology, if it deserves that name, is nationalist, patriotic, and religious. That is much more firmly rooted in Russia. It's a kind of reversion to the norm. The degree of political control. Soviets had a form of totalitarianism which tried to control almost everything all the time, although naturally it couldn't succeed at doing that. That's humanly impossible. Putin's is a form of authoritarianism, which means it's less total. There is one newspaper in Moscow called Novaya Gazeta, which tells the truth, and Gorbachev is a co-owner of it, interestingly enough. There is one radio station in Moscow called Echo Moskvy, Echo of Moscow, which tells the truth, and Putin allows it to broadcast. In Soviet times, you had to have permission to travel abroad, and for most of the Soviet era, that was limited to very few people. Putin allows people to travel abroad. He doesn't try to prevent that. In that sense, his brand of control is more effective and less resisted, and likely, therefore, to last longer. Foreign policy. Under the Soviets, they were so anti-Western and so stupidly anti-Western so much of the time that there was a kind of boomerang effect, and people got more and more pro-Western. And when Gorbachev started reforms, in the beginning, they welcomed his effort at democratization. Putin, on the other hand, is a little more subtle, and his anti-Westernism is not ideological, as based on Marx and Lenin. Capitalism is all bad. It's more, the West is anti-Russian. It's nationalist and patriotic. And one of the scariest things about the new Cold War, compared to the old one, is that Russians, I think now, are much more sincerely anti-American than they were in Soviet times. The Soviets had an empire. As a result, they were overextended. They were in Afghanistan, they were all over the world, and they suffered from that. Gorbachev dropped the empire, and Putin is not rebuilding another empire, but he is trying in a much more devious, complicated way to control or influence others, both in the near abroad, intervention in Ukraine, Georgia, intervention in Georgia, Syria, intervention in Syria, and mucking around in Europe, not to mention the seizure of Crimea. Does Putin have any weaknesses? Well, the system is quite corrupt, and Russians don't like that. There is no rule of law, which means when you sign a contract with a Russian business, you can't count on it being enforced, because if the other side has access to the judges, you will lose. It is overextended, or it could be Syria, for example, but the most dangerous thing for Putin, I think, will be his succession, because he's not preparing anybody to take over who will necessarily be viewed as legitimate. And the Soviet period teaches us that when the dictator dies, all hell can break loose, as it did after Lenin died, after Stalin died, and we'll see what happens even after Khrushchev was forced out. Okay, I guess I will stop there. I'll say 2 or 3 more things about United States policy toward Putin's Russia. And here I'll begin with what may strike some of you as heresy and maybe others not at all. I think in some ways Donald J. Trump is right. What do I mean? He talks about how the Cold War was a product both of American and Soviet behavior. And if you think back, the expansion of NATO up to the Baltic borders, the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999 under Clinton, the Iraq War without the permission of the United Nations, the Libyan intervention, which the Russian President Medvedev abstained on. Putin wasn't in office at that point, but the UN resolution was for saving the residents of Benghazi from genocide, but it turned out that we in the West went beyond that and eliminated Gaddafi. Then there are, and here I think Putin is not so right, and I wouldn't go along with Trump if this is what he's trying to say, the colored revolutions, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Putin thinks that we were behind these things. I think we were happy to see them. We offered advice, but they were mostly indigenous developments. And I think Trump is also right that we need to talk to the Russians about how to lower these tensions because they're higher than they need to be. We continue to have common interests with the Russians, like preventing proliferation of nuclear weapons, fighting terrorism, fighting climate change, although Trump obviously doesn't even recognize that to be a problem. But the hitch is, and this is ironic, and here I am going to be political, I think Trump's behavior undermines and cancels out the good things he says, because he appears to be so often so much of a stooge of Putin that when he argues for talks, people resist and say, we don't trust you to have these talks. And probably rightly so. So it's an irony that this president of ours actually says some things that strike me as correct, but then undermines his whole approach to the Russians by behaving in the way that he does. Well, forgive me for getting political at the end, but I hope I've given you some food for thought. And let's take down this sad picture of Gorbachev and maybe go back to the one at the beginning which is also on the cover of my book. Or maybe leave it, whichever one you want. Let's go back to the beginning. There. I'm happy. I've taken up too much time, but I'm happy to take questions or comments or objections or anything.
So that they're picked up on the mic.
What's that?
Questions so that they're picked up on the mic.
Oh, I repeat the question. That assumes I can hear them in the first place.
You mentioned that he's in ill health.
Sorry?
You mentioned that Gorbachev is in ill health
Yes.
now.
Oh, more details? Yeah. Well, I don't know his whole medical history, but he has diabetes, he has high blood pressure, he had his carotid artery reamed, he had an operation on his eyes, he had an operation on his throat. The last time we saw him was in June 1986. He came in with a cane, lowered himself into his seat with pain. He's still got it up here. In fact, if you watch the movie announcement, a new movie has been made about him called Meeting Gorbachev by a movie director you probably heard of, Werner Herzog. We saw it recently in Colorado. I don't think it has a distributor yet, but part of it, half of it is Herzog's interview with Gorbachev, and the other half is documentary footage about his life. So if you want to see him, that's where you can see him. Yes?
So there's no mechanism or political machinery in place now to take down Putin the way Gorbachev was taken down?
No, Gorbachev, you see, when Gorbachev took over, if he had cared about keeping his power, he would have presided over the status quo. The mechanism for removing him was a product of his own efforts to open up, to democratize, to reform, to allow people to speak and to assemble. Putin learned the lesson. As Putin has said, the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And that's obviously his view of what Gorbachev produced. So he is not following in Gorbachev's footsteps, but rather limiting the forces that might try to move him out. Yes?
So in the last election, when you got 1% of the vote, did you stay consistent with that same platform of democratizing?
Yes, did you hear the question? Did Gorbachev in that last election of 1996 stay consistent with his program of democratizing? Mostly yes. He criticized Yeltsin for bombing the parliament, which Yeltsin did in 1993, destroying democracy in order to save it. Not quite, but, and he has been very critical of Putin as a leader at home. But this is very interesting. Gorbachev has also said upon occasion that Russia needs a certain dose of authoritarianism. It's as if he's learned the lesson from his own troubles, that he had hoped that Soviet Union could be democratized in a few short years. At one point in the last, about 12 years ago, he said, it may take decades for Russia to be democratized. And he said it may even take the whole 21st century. So I think he was prepared, and he supported Putin for election in 2000, and he supported him for re-election in 2004. He did not support him in 2012. And he criticizes him for cracking down too much. But I think in the beginning he kind of hoped that Putin would be a benevolent despot who would create order and then resume a march toward greater democracy. But it hasn't turned out that way. He also is very supportive of Putin in foreign affairs. He approves of the seizure of Crimea. He doesn't blame Putin for the intervention in Ukraine. And I think some of this goes back to his disillusionment with the West. He shares Putin's notion that the West pushed too far, that the West acted as if it had won the Cold War and could now rule the world. He said some very harsh things about the West. Ma'am, yes?
So because he is supporting some of, seems to be supporting some of Putin's decisions, is he regarded as a political enemy, would you say?
By Putin? By Putin?
Mm-hmm. Would he fear for his life? You know, I mean, he has bodyguards and his...
Is Gorbachev regarded as a political enemy by Putin? Since 2012, they haven't talked to each other. Gorbachev has said some very harsh things about Putin, although he usually tries to soften them a little bit. I don't think Putin is going to touch him, especially at the age of 87, frail and ill as he is. What I'm afraid of is that the moment that Gorbachev dies, the men with black masks and guns will descend on the Gorbachev Foundation in Moscow, where there is a wonderful archive of documents, and probably confiscate them. Yes?
Any thoughts on why Trump is so deferential to Putin and he doesn't want to criticize Putin?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Sid. What did he say?
Any thoughts on why Trump is so deferential to Putin and doesn't want to criticize Putin?
Oh. I'm not an expert on that. The question was, why is Trump so defensive of Putin? So, deferential, same thing. Like most of you, I'm waiting for Mueller's report. I don't know. Yes?
I think in the late 60s, early 70s, Sam Huntington was making the case that Russia was rising from within, and it was only a matter of time that the Soviet Union would fall. So given that, does Reagan get credit for accelerating the process, or was he just in the right place at the right time?
I think Reagan did indeed have that idea that if we push them, and if we spend a lot more on things that threaten them, and if they find they can't spend enough themselves to match what we're doing, they may be in trouble. I think it's a big leap from that to say that he brought them down, because that would leave out the story that basically I've told you about the weaknesses of the Soviet Union in many fields, and about Gorbachev's life, which brought him long before Reagan to the view that Soviet Union needed the very reforms he tried to carry out, which were what brought about the end. On this question of who ended the Cold War, I have a kind of thought experiment that I would suggest to you. Imagine that Reagan is hit by a truck in 1979 and doesn't become American president. So Gorbachev is dealing with somebody else. I think the Cold War would have ended, especially if that somebody else was Bush, who cooperated with him to end the Cold War. Now reverse it and imagine that Gorbachev is hit by a truck in 1984 and doesn't become the Soviet leader, and Reagan is the same. I don't think the Cold War would have ended, because the other people in the Politburo would have decided to resist Reagan rather than to join with him in the way that the two men did. Sid.
Could you speak very briefly about Springfield's role in the
Yes, Springfield World Affairs Council is mentioned in this book. Because your World Affairs Council, Western New England, right? Western Massachusetts, sorry. It was just before, which trip? Was it to Moscow? It was just before one of Reagan's trips to, either to Moscow in '88, it might have been that one. I think that was it. Reagan gave a talk here. Some of you may have been there. Yes? And it was a pretty rough talk, as I recall. And Gorbachev was told about it. And when he heard about it, he concluded that their summit, which was coming up, was going to be a disaster because Reagan was going to sock it to him and was changing his tune after having cooperated him for quite a while. And I describe in the book, I don't remember the page, I should have prepared. I describe in the book the scene in the Kremlin when Gorbachev throws in Reagan's face this talk he gave to this group. But it works out well. He decides to let it go, and Reagan doesn't repeat what he said here. So you folks were almost responsible for the continuation of the Cold War.
So we're going to end here, so thank you very much. I have a gift for you, which is a copy of Never Look an American in the Eye by one of our former speakers, Oki Yundibi, which I think you'll enjoy.
Thank you.
And Deb and Joanne are going to be selling copies of the books, and Bill has graciously agreed to sign them. So thank you all for coming.